Okay, I am delighted to be speaking with Mike Campbell today, an American polyglot based in Taiwan. Now, not only does Mike speak Mandarin Chinese to an insane level, but he's also learned a lot of other Chinese dialects, and he's even some indigenous Taiwanese languages that are dangerously close to going extinct as well. So really interesting. Mike is the founder of Glossika, which you can see on his t-shirt, which is an AI-based online language learning platform that uses mass exposure to sentences to help you learn vocabulary and grammar in context. And you know that I'm a big believer in learning through input and context. So I'm really excited to talk to Mike today and to find out a little bit about his background and how Glossika works as well. So Mike, great to be talking to you.
Yeah, it's great to finally get the chance to talk to you as well.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your language background, because it is an incredibly interesting background that you have with languages. So how would you characterize your story with languages?
Well, I mean, like you just mentioned, I've made Taiwan my home, and I spent my youth growing up in Europe. And so after I moved to Asia, actually, I ended up immigrating several years ago. So now I'm a naturalized citizen of Taiwan. And so Taiwan's actually got a real wealth of languages. If you're a polyglot, if you're a language learner, language lover, it's a great place to live. The standard of living, of course, is very high, and it's a very comfortable place to live, very convenient place. So I've really enjoyed all my years here, and just to kind of get down to what the language situation is like here, there are two major language families spoken on the island. The traditional indigenous set of languages are what people just call Formosan languages. You know, the original name of Taiwan was Formosa. Just the name, like a beautiful place. It really is a beautiful island. But the indigenous languages are Austronesian. And so there's an Austronesian branch, and it's not a single branch. It's like 9 or 10 different branches. And so these languages are extremely old, ancient languages, but they are on the verge of extinction. Fortunately, there's still about 100,000 speakers of some of the larger languages and just a dozen of the smaller languages. So, I mean, I've got as you can see on my bookshelves behind me, I've got a grammar for the Thao language. I've got a grammar for the Atayal language. I've got a grammar for the Shai-Shiat language. They're all written in Chinese, so it's sort of like you need to know Chinese first to get access to these languages. But I started my career off many years ago as a Chinese translator and interpreter, and so that was when I was really young, and so I got that under my belt, and I've used that to go on and do many other things since then. So I think having a really strong base in Chinese or a major world language is absolutely important, wherever you are in the world. If you're in the Arabic speaking region or Spanish speaking or Russian speaking, I think it's really, really important as a polyglot to get one or two of the other major United Nations languages as one of your tool languages. Yeah. And then, you know, one of my goals in life is probably perhaps to learn at least a language from every major language family, whether that's Niger, Congo, Bantu, or Dravidian, or some of the ones I haven't really gotten into, Uralic, you know. So there's a lot of really interesting language families out there where it's just, you know, I may not be looking for like trying to achieve some sort of a fluency in those languages, but being able to understand and just get some input. Being able to read stories like maybe Kalevala or something like this would be really exciting to do in the local language.
And it definitely gets easier as well, doesn't it? The more languages you learn, the more you kind of have this overall view of the structure of language and stuff like that.
Oh, definitely, because you find out that, you know, human communication just takes on different masks, but it's the same. You know, it's coming down from deep inside. Yeah, it's the same. And so you would think, well, I bet Chinese people just don't have that way of expressing it, but actually they do, you know, because it comes down to just basic, you know, we as humans share so much in common with each other. So there's so much that you can discover. We actually have a team in Russia, and I was just having this conversation with them earlier this week where they were saying, it's just really, really silly in Russian to say something, well, I'm afraid that, you know, something that English speakers use quite often, because you wouldn't just say this in Russian. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm afraid that. They're like, why are you sorry? Why are you afraid? What are you afraid? And I said, well, it's really interesting because the Chinese people speak like that as well. So there's a lot of similarities between English and Chinese. It used in discourse, in the discourse register, which may not be similar between other European languages, which are actually closer in, genetic difference.
That's an interesting example, because as a British person, like, I am used to kind of apologizing before I say anything. So I'm terribly sorry. I'm awfully sorry. So it's always interesting to see like other languages where that doesn't exist at all, but also when it's a major part of the language. I remember thinking that between English and Japanese, you've got these same kind of cultural requirements to kind of just temper a little bit what you're about to say. So that's absolutely fascinating. Let's talk about Chinese then, because you said that you obviously Chinese is your base language, and that is your kind of jumping off point for a lot of other things you've learned. What was your basic journey of learning Chinese? You started very young, but what was your route to proficiency? Like
you mentioned earlier in the introduction, the mass sentence method has always been something that I found a lot of success with Chinese and other languages in the region. And so I've gone on to use that for other European languages and other languages on the way. I've just gotten the most exposure to Chinese. So Chinese is my best foreign language. Now it's more like an adopted native language.
But did you learn Chinese in Taiwan, or was it outside Taiwan?
Yes, it was in Taiwan. And so it's, and I'm speaking about Mandarin in particular. I mean, there are other Chinese languages like Taiwanese, which is Southern Min. Hokkien is another name for it. But there's Hakka, which is different than Hokkien. There's Cantonese. Shanghainese belongs to the Wu language, or Wu language. So there's different regional languages. And these languages have lexical differences as large as between language groups in Europe. Like, there was a study once done that the lexical similarity between Mandarin and Taiwanese is around 20 to 25%. Compared to English and Russian, 30%, you'd say that Taiwanese is more different than Mandarin as English is to Russian. So there's some of these comparisons and research that has been done. Like, how different are these languages? They're quite different, and they have very long histories. Like, Taiwanese is about a 2,000-year-old language, which predates, Slavic and Germanic, or maybe not. Going back to the original Slavic and Germanic branching is about that age. So it's quite fascinating to do the cross comparison between the language families and the age of the language families. Yeah.
So you mentioned the mass sentence method. So let's dive into this, because I know this is the cornerstone of Glossika and how Glossika works, but it's also how you learned Chinese. So what is the mass sentence method in a sentence? Before we dive into detail?
Well, I think that what I've done over the years is I've done a lot of improvements to the basic concept of the mass sentence method. Is just basically you take several thousand sentences and you record yourself, or you just pronounce them out loud, and you get it to the point where I see a new sentence and then I can say it fluently without looking at the text. So or I can hear somebody say a sentence and I can repeat that whole sentence fluently after hearing it, after once or twice. And so being able to take what you hear and being able to repeat it means that you have grasped all of the sounds in that sentence. Not only that, but you're able to lexically parse that sentence in your mind and say, okay, I know what I'm saying. I'm saying this verb, I'm saying this adverb, and I'm saying this noun, and blah, 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 blah. And you're able to, and you may even move things around and it still makes sense, but in a way you're able to actually now make that your own. I mean, it might come out in your own voice, and you may turn words around a little bit. It's paraphrased in a way, but it becomes yours.
Yeah, so even if you don't necessarily understand all the different grammatical components of those sentences, the fact that you have the experience of producing it starts, I imagine, to kind of hardwire these different pathways in your brain.
Neurons, yeah.
Much like kids start to kind of repeat sentences before they really understand exactly what it is that they're saying.
It's exactly what children do, though. I mean, it's exactly what they're doing. And before they're able to say things clearly, the children are just blah, 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 blah. And then you're like, what is my child saying? And then blah, 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 and it gets a little bit clearer month by month. And then you're like, oh, I understand what you almost have to like tune your ear to your child's voice. And by the age of 5 or 6, they're speaking very clearly. So I think that if you have a flexible tongue, even as an adult, I find it very helpful to just go through and train on IPA symbols and just get your mouth like moving around all of these different vowels and consonants.
Yeah. And this gets over this hurdle that many beginner learners have of never actually getting around to speaking. It's going to study, and then one day when I'm ready, I might start to speak the language. But actually, I think most well, for me, the day when you feel ready to speak never really comes. So I always feel that it's a good idea to start speaking fairly early on, even if you're just getting your mouth used to the sounds of the language. And the method that you're describing here just gets you producing those sounds right from the beginning.
Right. And I think that I've been listening to a lot of what other polyglots or other language teachers have been sharing online in recent years, and I find that some of my methods are a little bit different than them, because a lot of them focus on like rehearsing a specific dialogue, and I'm really horrible at it. He's like, okay, introduce where you're from and what do you do? And I'm really shy when it comes to this. And I'm just like, I hate doing that. I just want to, I love your program because you do stories, and stories is a huge foundation to how I learn Chinese as well. I mean, I've got all of these old storybooks for how I learn Chinese, and these are just full of like, I mean, I went through these books and I took notes and all kinds of things. And then recently they just published The Little Prince in Taiwanese, in Southern Min Hokkien. And this actually has the QR code, so you can actually scan it and go to YouTube and listen to the whole chapter led by a professional team of recorders. And they have different voices, children's voices, women and men's voices on the team that recorded this. And so this is really fascinating to be able to hear The Little Prince in other Chinese languages now. And so this has become like part of my, I wouldn't say daily routine, but I come back to it maybe once a month to kind of go through another section of the book and kind of retouch on my Taiwanese. And it's just, stories is a really important part of language learning. It's something that we haven't really done much in Glossika yet, but it's something that I really look forward to.
Well, we'll talk about stories in more depth over on your channel when we're going to do the second part of this conversation over on the Glossika channel. So everyone should hop over to Glossika to see that, where we're going to discuss stories. But going back to the mass sentence method then, Mike, how does the mass sentence method fit in the dichotomy of kind of learning versus practice? Do you see it as a way to actually learn and acquire, or is it to practice language, or is there even a distinction there?
Well, I think it's really important that you have native speakers produce sentences for you before you start to produce the language on your own. And the reason for that is because, if it's like a language like Russian, you have all of your verb tenses and your noun declensions all built into the sentence. And that needs to make sense to a native speaker. The native speaker says, yes, this is how we say it. And it's in the right word order, especially word order sensitive language like Chinese. So it's really important that a native speaker has built that sentence for you. And then you take that, and then you know enough about the grammar, what a third person conjugation looks like, or what the past participles look like. You're able to recognize. Maybe you're not able to memorize all of the aspects of the grammar, but when you see it, you're like, I know that's an adverb. Oh, I know that's an adjective. You're able to recognize these things. And what I do is, I always tell beginners, your heart is the core of your body, just like the verb is the core of the word core itself means heart, actually, the core of the sentence. So when you take a sentence from a story or from a practice sentence, find the verb or the string of verbs, because there might be more than one in that sentence, and use that as an anchor for the rest of the sentence. And when you express that verb, it's like this is where the energy is coming out of, and then everything else attaches to that verb. The way that I've improved the mass sentence method over time, though, is it's important that the sentences that you're working on really fit the level that you're at. So if you're at an A1 or an A2 level, it's important that those sentences are fit for your level. So this is part of the work we've been doing over the last few years, is trying to figure out the level and now analyzing these sentences for both structure complexity and for the level of the vocabulary in that sentence, so that it's not too above your level, but you're getting 90% input, which is understandable or comprehensible input. And then that N+1 is what you pick up along the way. And so that's something that's different than stories, though. So there's two different approaches here. I think that with the mass sentences, it's important that you're working at the right level. Okay, so I'm done.
Yeah, well, so that was going to be my next question. Actually, you've already touched on it, so it's a great transition. How does this method? How do you apply this at the beginner level? Because I can imagine that you've got this. I mean, I think many of the language learning methods which polyglots tend to use in real life, kind of they kick in a way after the very beginner level, because experienced language learners generally have their own way of learning the real fundamentals or basics in a language quite quickly, and then they start to start applying the method that they've used and proven over time. But those methods aren't always intuitive for people who are coming to language learning new. So how do you approach the kind of zero beginner level in Glossika?
Now I have to put on my business hat. So as a businessman, I mean, you have to think about, in the language learning industry, most of the companies out there are targeting these people. And we're talking about the 100 million, 200, 500 million groups of people that are just, well, I'm supposed to download this app and get and learn a language. And so I'm just like, it's super basic. And well, the problem with that is, well, okay, so there's a lot of companies competing in that space. So what I say is, go ahead and try their products, because we're focusing on the space that's just beyond that. So I think that on Glossika, you can start in any new language. If you've got 100 vocabulary words, you know how to say come and go and eat and tired and hungry and whatnot. But you can say a few basic sentences. You know how to say, hi, my name is Michael, or what's your name? Where do it come from? If you can get those basics down, which takes literally like 5 to 10 minutes. I mean, you could sit down with a new grammar book or maybe an app. There's some really fun apps out there that are like very well designed little games. You can pick up a few vocabulary words. You can pick up, but the challenge comes to, how are you going to put those things into sentences? And so that's the kind of thing that we're focusing on, is that you're able to distinguish, okay, here's a noun, here's a verb in the sentence, but how do I put that together? And how do you get the grammar to fit? You need the proper word endings, or what we call declensions. You need the verbs to change properly. And then in some languages like Chinese, or Japanese, are you supposed to focus on this really complex writing system, which can really, really slow you down and demotivate you unless you're super fascinated by these things and you have an incessant amount of energy to just tackle it. And that's not the average person. But I think the average person wants to say, well, I need to learn some Japanese because I'm doing this for my job, or I need to learn some Chinese because I'm going to have a lot of interactions with Chinese people in the next couple of years. So what should you be focusing on? First, the sound system of Chinese is extremely, extremely challenging. And that applies for anybody from around the world. If you're going to start learning any Chinese language, it's extremely challenging. Japanese, on the other hand, is a little bit easier to pronounce. It's actually really easy to mispronounce. But for almost the exact opposite reasons. But and then Korean is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's hard to pronounce, but yet it's easier than Chinese. And okay, so going back to the Chinese, though, is that you've got both the tonal system and you've got these squishy, squashy sounds. 如果我现在就是开始跟你讲一大堆的中文，你就会一直听到一些you're going to hear a lot of these sounds in the language. Okay, so it's really a challenge to learn how to string all of your words together in that way. And so that's probably the biggest challenge for everybody. But Chinese word order is a little bit of a challenge, but the grammar and everything else should be easier. So I think that if you're going to focus on Chinese, what you need to do is you need to get a text that is completely Romanized. And that is Romanized. Yeah. You learn how to pronounce each of the pinyin letters properly, and you're able to say a sentence fluently first. And if you want to learn the characters, then learn the characters for the sentence you just learned how to say fluently. Because just like a child, the child already knows how to say these things, and then they look at the text and they learn the characters. It's easy for them to pick it up because those characters represent something that they already know how to say.
Yeah, there's as you know, there's a massive debate in the Chinese and Japanese worlds in particular about, you know, should you learn characters from the beginning or should you wait till later? You can argue both sides, right? But one thing that's clear is that learning the sound system and learning to pronounce the fundamental core sounds of the language is something that you should do right from the beginning, because if you don't do it, then everything gets harder the longer you leave it. And so that's one of the things that I think Glossika does super well, is promoting that acquisition of the sounds.
Well, I remember my first experience with the language was that even living in the language here for the first 6 months, I could not understand a thing.
How old were you at this point, Mike?
Well, I was just around 18 or 19 years old. Okay. And so I was young enough to kind of get the language where it would become something I would have for life once I mastered it, you know. So and I did at that point. So it was a good age to really sit down with it and learn the language. But the second thing is that I had built up a vocabulary. I could read at least 1,000 characters by the first 6 months, and I could read basic stories, like I just shared, but I could not understand anything that people were saying. I couldn't understand the responses unless it was like really narrow type of things that I had already learned. And it took me a long time to parse. And even if I was going to read, I could not read a sentence fluently at full speed with the right pronunciation unless I transcribed it into pinyin, and then I could read it at full speed and with the correct pronunciation. But my pronunciation was still wrong for a while. So I would suggest to everybody is like, don't beat yourself up or kill yourself over this idea that I have to have perfect pronunciation at the very beginning, because I think you need to work towards fluency. And there's one point, and I think it was around 7 or 8 months into the language, where I was just about to give up. And then suddenly, like over a period of a week, it was like the radio, when you turn the radio knob, for the people out there that are old enough to remember, when it's slightly off the radio station, it sounds fuzzy. But when you turn it right into the right position, everything sounds super clear. And that's what happened in Chinese. It's like the radio knob just became clearer and clearer and clearer. And one day I went out and I used to do this thing where I would I was a poor guy at that age, and I would just kind of get on the bus and I would ride the bus all the way across the city and then all the way back home. It would take a whole day or half a day. And I would take a little notebook and I would write all of the conversations that I heard while sitting on the bus. And that kind of a transcribing or dictation was extremely helpful. And I actually ended up learning different dialects. Like I would go back and sit down with a language exchange. And this is back in the 90s. I wasn't using the internet much. So I was using paper dictionaries and doing things the hard way. But doing things the hard way is actually sometimes a good thing.
I agree.
These sort of things.
Yeah.
So when you actually put in the effort on stuff, you remember the experience of going through learning it. And so the second thing is that I would learn phrases in Taiwanese, and I would ask my tutor, like, what does this mean? I couldn't find it in the dictionary. And then she was just start laughing and it's like, how did you learn Taiwanese? I'm like, I don't know, I just heard it. I'm learning the language off the street. So half of it's in the book, half of in the books, and half of it's on the street or out on the bus.
This process of kind of just going through and just hacking your way through the early stages of the language, one word, one sound at a time. This is something I've been through so many times in languages like Cantonese and Egyptian Arabic, where you've got no resource. Even today, you've got virtually no useful resources in those languages, or very, very few.
This is how I learned the aboriginal languages. I went up to the mountains and I lived there and I transcribed. I just asked them how to say this and this and this. And eventually I went over to another elder teacher. And this guy didn't even speak Mandarin. He could speak Taiwanese. And so I had to use Taiwanese to actually learn one of the Aboriginal languages from him. And this is before they had published grammars and dictionaries. And now they have websites with all these great resources. And it's just like, it was a very fascinating journey to go through and actually learn a language in the mountains without any resources. And I'm just so happy to have had that experience, because all the elders have now passed away and the language it just doesn't exist. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that one of the best things about what you guys are doing over at Glossika is the fact that you are, I mentioned before about my having to hack my way through these languages where you have very few resources. Glossika was one of the resources that has always been available. I used, you've always been very supportive over the years, and you've given me access to to Glossika. I used it in Cantonese. I think I used it in Arabic. I think you were making Egyptian Arabic as I was learning it. I think you gave me Thai at one point as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, thank you very much for all the work that you're doing for the community. It's a fantastic addition.
We've built a new platform called Viva, viva.glossika.com, or you can search Glossika Viva. And that platform supports 7,000 languages. And it's for people who speak a language that is not available on Glossika yet. We support dialects. We support all kinds of things. And so you can go in and you can apply to be a translator or reporter of your native language. Let's say you speak Nahuatl or Cherokee or Cree, and we don't have Ojibwe or whatever, and you want to add your language to Glossika. We welcome everybody to come and sign up. And there's a little bit of an application process, and it takes a little bit of time for us to go over everything, but we're getting people added into the system. And so it provides a much faster way to get these languages out to the communities. And there's also a profit sharing, a revenue sharing model for that. So if people are actually paying users of Glossika that are going over your content, some of that, those earnings will also get shared with the collaborators who work with us on Viva. So I just wanted to let your viewers know that this is a great possibility. I think right now we have about 300 or 400 new languages in prep.
You're going to be busy. You guys are going to have your work cut out for you. It makes what we do by comparison look like child's play. Mike, it's been great to talk. For people who want to find out more about Glossika, they can go over to your channel. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Any particular links you'd like people to go to? Is it ai.glossika.com? Is that the main your main website?
Glossika.com. It's just the Glossika.com homepage.
Cool. Well, Mike, it's been great to talk, and I look forward to the next one.
See you. Thanks, everybody.